How you doing?
Hey, pretty good. How about you?
I'm doing great. So basically what I'm doing is I work for the school media station at Oregon State. So I've kind of just been trying to get these interviews set up with different people from the gaming industry, pop culture and all that, and kind of just talk to them a little bit about what they do, why they do it, all that. So,
Yeah. Cool.
first off, thanks for doing this with me today.
Yeah, sure. No problem.
For people that don't know you, who are you? What's like elevator pitch of Steve Gaynor?
I'm one of the co-founders of Fulbright. We're a small independent game studio in Portland, Oregon, and we made Gone Home, and then most recently we released our new game Tacoma. They're both story adventure games that are about exploring a space to discover the narrative that happened there. And before that, I spent a number of years working on the Bioshock series as a designer before I started my own company.
All right. What's your official position at Fulbright? Because I know you've done all that, but I don't know the specifics.
I mean, the only title that I really have is co-founder. Me and my other co-founder, Carla, run the company and are kind of, the project leads on our games. Carla and I are also the story team together, so I write the dialogue and the story stuff, and I was the designer on Gone Home because it was a team of four, so there was one designer and one 2D artist and one 3D artist and one programmer, and that was the whole team. But on Tacoma, I'm more of the director. I work with our designers on what goes into the game, and I work with Carla on the story, and I work with our artists on helping direct what things should look like, and it's just sort of a direction and oversight kind of position along with actually writing the story and the dialogue and that stuff.
Okay. So you mentioned that you went through all of this stuff. You worked on Bioshock. It was Minerva's Den, right?
I was a level designer on the main game of Bioshock 2, and then I was the lead and a designer on Minerva's Den, and then I worked for a year as a senior level designer on Bioshock Infinite, but I left before that project shipped.
Okay. What kind of led you to go and start Fulbright?
Well, I had been working on Bioshock Infinite for a year, and I went to college in Portland, and my wife is from here, and we had been moving around for school and jobs and stuff for a good 5 or 6 years by the time I finished at Irrational, and I just kind of realized I didn't want to work on games that were that big anymore. Because Bioshock Infinite is just and games like it are just such huge productions with hundreds of people on them and everything. And so my wife and I just wanted to move back to Portland and just get back here to be in the city where we wanted to end up in. And because there's not a big established games industry in Portland, that basically meant, I either needed to do remote contract work or, remote team work to kind of keep doing what I do, or we needed to start our own studio. So I reached out to a couple of people that I had used to have worked with before at 2K Marin about if they'd want to come up and start something with me, and here we are.
Well, you guys are making great stuff. Gone Home, personally, is one of my favorite games, just kind of period. It's one
Thank you so
promote
much.
a bunch.
It's really cool to hear.
Yeah. But kind of, what was it's a pretty big deal, that game, and the story that you guys tell. What kind of inspired that?
Well, we come from a very design-first background in terms of, we started from wanting to make a game that was about exploring an environment and finding the story that happened there and finding about the people that, lived there or spent their time there. When we determined that it was just going to be about that and not combat and not puzzles or anything along those lines, not traditional challenge kind of stuff, that we could just make it a story about a family, going through whatever issues, just sort of a relatable domestic setting, which most games don't really have access to in a lot of ways, because there's something that's supernatural, or there's something that is, some kind of threat, or there's, whatever, zombies or something. And so when we saw we had the opportunity, we wanted to take advantage of it and tell a story that you don't really usually get to experience in games, because we hadn't had the opportunity to really talk about other kinds of subject matter, and a lot of people, didn't have, there's not a lot of places to get that in games, I think. I think coming from the Bioshock series and coming from having worked, on stuff set in Rapture and worked on stuff set in Columbia, I think that there was a strong culture or outlook of not shying away from subject matter that might be a little bit harder to wrap your head around how to represent it the right way, or make it into a game, because a lot of the themes in Bioshock are okay, well, that's not the easiest stuff to make a game about, how do we make that accessible to players, and how do we make it feel authentic and everything. And so I think that we brought that with us to say, we'll tell the story from Sam's perspective. We'll invest in figuring out how to do it right, instead of saying, well, that sounds, hard, or that sounds risky, so we just shouldn't do it,
Yeah, that makes sense. And full disclosure, I've yet to play Tacoma, so I'm going to try not to spoil it for other people and myself, because, I'm a guy against spoilers. So kind of how did Gone Home affect Tacoma when you guys were thinking it? Was there a pressure to make something like that after Gone Home was such a big deal to people?
I mean, I think if anything, it felt more like the impetus was to try not to retread the same territory again. I feel like if we were to say it has to have the same kind of emotional terrain, or it has to, investigate similar issues, or kind of maintain a certain perspective, that a big part of what I think affected people about Gone Home was that it was, that it was different, and it wasn't something that they expected. And so I think that just trying to revisit that territory immediately would have been both hard and probably not actually spoken to what excited people about Gone Home. So anyway, our outlook was to say, how do we rely on what we know how to do well, and then how do we expand on that and push ourselves to talk about a different kind of setting, a futuristic setting, where we don't get to just say, what was stuff that was in the 90s, let's put it in the game. We have to do, more of the world building and make players more involved with the events that are happening to the characters, in, as they're happening, but still have this kind of investigation, experience Gone Home, and hopefully bring people something that feels like it stands on its own, but still comes from us. So that was, I think, really what Gone Home kind of pushed us towards when working on Tacoma.
Well, I mean, I'd definitely say a space station is a bit different than a house.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, setting-wise, there's that, and then, I think the feeling of, what you do and what it feels like to progress through the game is hopefully very different as well,
So, speaking of feeling, how's it feel to finally have the game out?
It's definitely a relief. It's always good to, have the thing out there in front of people and be able to be kind of living in a world where other people are playing it, not just where you're nervously awaiting them playing it someday. So, no, it's cool. And having been able to see people's reactions has been great. And we're working on, all of the kind of post-release patch stuff, and, various support that we're doing for the game. Yeah, it's good to be out of making the game mode and into the game's actually out there mode,
Yeah, definitely get it out there, see how people are doing, fix bugs. There was the whole, not being able to start the game or something. I remember reading about that. What was that like?
There was a bug that affected some people on Xbox, and it took a little while to figure that out because we didn't see it until the game was actually released, and then people started reporting it. It's like, okay, well, gotta like scramble to figure out what's happening and fix it and like get it submitted for cert and all that kind of stuff. But that guy's good to go now. So it's hard, like, because when you're making a game, you're making a creative product. You're making a story and experience and a thing that people experience like other media, but also you're making software. And like it has this whole other level of kind of having to think about how the thing works as like computer software, and how to think of how it works as just like, are people gonna be enjoying this part of the game or whatever. But that's how it goes. It's just part of the job.
So it kind of bounces between having to focus on both a lot because of the interactivity of video games and stuff like that.
Yeah, and all of the different moving parts that come along with, like, it has to run and run well and be stable and not crash and not have any issues if somebody has the wrong video driver or, like it's using this peripheral that we didn't expect or something like that, right? So I feel like, it's very different from, like, okay, we make the movie, now you put it on Netflix, you figure out how people download it. Like that's not our problem. I mean, you're much more involved in like the functionality of it when it's an actual interactive product, I think.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because there's an interactivity in video games that you don't get in movies, TV, music, all that stuff.
And like a lack of standardization. Like that's why like file formats become standardized and stuff. It's like you can make an MP3, and then that can play on anything that can play an MP3. And if the MP3 doesn't play right, then it's like the problem of the software or the hardware that's trying to play it, not like you making a song into an MP3. Whereas like from our end, it's like when you're making a game, you have to code the game correctly to run right on an Xbox or a PC or on Macintosh or Linux or different people's laptops or like whatever. So it's just a lot more on the software development side, I think.
Yeah. Okay, to backtrack a little bit to earlier on, you mentioned earlier that you went to college in Portland. Did you go to PSU, UP?
Yeah, I went to Portland State. Yeah.
Okay. When you were at UP, UP? You said?
Portland State.
Portland State. I mix those up all the time. I lived there and I still mix them up. When you went to PSU, did you know that you wanted to make video games?
I didn't know really that was what I wanted to try to do until kind of the end of college, like the last like year and a half before I graduated. So I was in the art program and I'd been doing a lot of illustration and figure drawing, and I had always drawn comics and done that kind of stuff when I was growing up, and that was the direction I thought I wanted to go in. And like maybe a year and a half before I finished college, I realized that wasn't what I wanted to do for my job, and that I should try to figure out how to make video games instead. Because it's just sort of like at some point, you have that realization that it's something you even theoretically could do, or it's sort of like, I don't think I'd really ever thought of it as being like, well, if I love games and I want to do something creative with my career, I could try to make games. But, that kind of, I had that realization at some point, and then that was the point where I was far enough into my degree that I wanted to finish my art degree, but I knew that I wasn't trying to get into like 2D art or illustration or actually use that as my career. So I chose my art degree concentration as sculpture because I had never really worked in like 3D, in like three-dimensional space, and I really chose it to learn about working in 3 dimensions and kind of learn how to do stuff that I didn't have much experience with as part of my degree. But then I went from there to my wife and I moved down to San Francisco, and I started in QA as a tester, and then I was like making my own level design portfolio on my own time while I was working as a tester. So my college stuff was sort of tangentially related. Like I feel like learning about, especially art history, like I was an art history minor, so learning about like architectural history and composition and actually working in 3-dimensional space informs how I think about like making stuff. But yeah, the fact that I sort of realized late that I was like, oh, I could try making games, was why my education isn't really directly relevant to that. You know?
What was that switch like at first?
I mean, it was cool. Like, I mean, I was taking like intro kind of stuff, and I took like intro to painting and color theory and other kind of like basic art degree stuff. But then getting into working in 3 dimensions was cool because I mean, college art classes are a good environment to be like learning as you go. Because like nobody there is super experienced, and you do critiques and you get to see what other people are doing. So it was an interesting place to start to get an idea of like how other people thought about what they were working on, and different professors' perspectives on what they did and all that kind of stuff.
Okay, and you said you did level design. Like, what kind of levels were you making? Like, 3D, 2D?
I was making first-person shooter levels. So there's a FPS series called Fear. The first game in the Fear series came out in like 2005, and I made levels for that because I knew I wanted to make like single-player story-based stuff, and they released their full toolkit tools. My brain just tried to say tool set and toolkit at the same time, and go with toolkit. But they released their full tool set for making content for their game. So you could basically theoretically, you could make anything that they had made in the game themselves as a modder. And so I was making first person scripted missions for the FPS Fear, which ended up being good because I knew somebody online who was working at a small game development studio in Texas that they were making an expansion pack for Fear because they had been contracted to like make an expansion pack, and they needed a level designer, and it was like, I already know how to make levels for Fear, like you should hire me. So that was basically how I got my first design job, was just kind of already knowing the tools and having somebody say you should apply here, and just like going for it.
And what kind of were the things that you learned with that first design job as opposed to making the levels on your own?
There's a lot that you learn about the practicalities of just like working on a development team, and like how actual like games get made in terms of I don't know, like working on your own in your home on your own stuff is definitely very different from coordinating with everybody else, and less in terms of like, I think maybe less in terms of creative collaboration and more in terms of just like distribution of work, just like understanding how the process goes for like coordinating your level with other people's levels, so it's like here's what comes before your level and after it, or working with the lead designer or programmers to be like, oh, if we're putting this new weapon in the game, like what if it did this or this, or that means I could do this kind of encounter in my level I'm working on, or working with artists on like art asset requests, and like how do you actually understand how to get new stuff made for your level versus requests that are just not going to happen, or ways you're going to have to like reuse something from somebody else's level, or just sort of all that stuff about like what's the actual process of putting all this stuff together into one game look like, as well as learning things like software, like best practices for like source control, like you're checking files in and out of a server and just coordinating with people to make sure that you don't like check in something that breaks the game and waste everybody else's time, and just like all those sorts of things, which was a really good. I was really glad that I worked at like a smaller studio on a project that didn't have a lot of scrutiny. Like nobody was like, oh, this expansion pack for Fear, it's like, like gonna change the industry or something.
The amount of people that know
like,
Fear versus Bioshock, that seems like a bit of a difference.
Yeah, and so like being able to kind of learn about a lot of that practical stuff and just working with the team and getting things into a game in an environment that was lower pressure, and that there was kind of more room to make mistakes without screwing up, because if you break the build on a game that has like 500 people working on it, that's way worse than if you break the build on this game that has like 25 people working on it. And so anyway, it was a really good learning environment, and I was glad that I got to contribute to that project.
Okay. Switching gears a little bit, this is for college students. So what is your advice to college students wanting to get into the games industry, wanting to do this kind of stuff?
I always feel like the most important thing is to know what you actually want, or know what kind of games you're really passionate about or inspired by. Because there's like a lot of games that anybody likes, but it's sort of like, what are the things that I am like driven by, or that I get obsessed by, above and beyond any other kind of game. And to be figuring out how to start making stuff like that, or contributing to stuff like that, because if you're just like super hardcore into, like very stat driven RPGs, then I think the most important thing is to figure out how you can make something like you would want to be playing, even if you're just like pointing towards it, but that could be anywhere from, making your own mods for like Skyrim or Fallout, if that's, the kind of game you're into, or if you're into like very 2D, kind of more traditional top-down RPGs or something, like working on Game Maker, RPG Maker, like, it's kind of seeing how you can find tools to start making the kind of stuff that really inspires you. Because, if you are really into like multiplayer FPS games, but you're like, oh, well, I want to make games, so maybe I'll make a platformer, a 2D platformer or something. Like, I think it's a lot more important to be able to show how you can be working on stuff that like is what you're excited about, than just to like be like, oh, this kind of game is easy to learn how to make, or this tool is really like popular in the games industry, so I should learn how to use it or something, because the flip side is also, if you're like, I'm really into super hard puzzle games, they're like 2D, like, like brain bending puzzle games, but they use the Unreal Engine a lot in the games industry, so I should make it Unreal level. Like, that's not going to be good for you either, right? And if you, but I mean, part of that is also like what part of making games you want to be involved in, because like at first I came from an art degree background, and I was like, oh, well, I'll learn to make game art. And I started doing that, and I spent some time with like 3D modeling programs and animation programs and stuff. And that was part of what made me realize that what I actually cared deeply about was like the design of the game, and like what the player does, and the events, and like how the systems work, as opposed to like what it looks like. And so I think that's also a similar part of it, is like, you have to try out the stuff you think you want to do and see if that really is it, and if you are super into, character art, and you start working on doing character art stuff, and you're like really into it, and you want to keep doing more of it, then the best thing you can do is like look for an indie team, or look for like a game jam team that's looking for an artist, and be like, I'm really excited about putting character art into a game. Can I add that into what you guys are doing? Because that'll take you to the point where you can say, hey, I'm a character artist for games. I don't just have like a portfolio of like my nice stuff that I made just like, over here and it stands on its own, but like, here's this thing that you can play where you can see my work in motion and in action and as part of a game. And like, now do you want me to work on your game? Whether that's working on a big AAA team as like a junior artist, or working on, an indie team that's making a bigger project, or, whatever it is. But knowing what you want to make, and then actually making some version of it so you can start putting that in front of people, and like working on more projects and making your way to where you want to end up is, I think, really important, and something that you can start, like right now, basically.
Yeah, follow the passion and kind of lead that to learning the tools and kind of stuff like that.
Yeah, and like, tools are easy, relatively speaking. Like, I mean, you put some time into learning an interface and you can use it. I mean, some interfaces are worse than others, some interfaces are better than others, some are more common or have better documentation, but like, you know, a lot of teams work with a lot of custom tools, you know, so I think that the more important thing than any given tool is just like finding whatever it takes to make stuff that represents what you want to be doing and like what you can bring to a project, and then be able to you know, put that in front of people and say like, I'd like to really be able to work on your project and bring my stuff to it, or get to a point where people are saying, we need a designer, and you were the designer on this cool Game Jam game. Would you want to come be a designer on our game that we have in development, or, you know, whatever, right? But having the stuff and then looking for opportunities and putting yourself out there so you have visibility, like, those are all really important, I think, kind of no matter where you want to end up.
All right, well, that's all the questions I have for you, Steve. Thank you very much for everything.
Yeah.
Where can people find you?
You can follow me on Twitter. I'm just at Fulbright, Fullbright. You can find out more about Gone Home at gonehome.game and Tacoma at tacoma.game. And both those games are on Steam and console. So, yeah, they're out there.
All right. Thank you very much, Steve.
Yeah, good talking to you.
My
pleasure. Have a good one.
You as well.
Yep, see ya.